Phantasmal Flames has not been released yet, but I decided I would take a gamble and guess what the most expensive card in this set will be. I think people are starting to get a bit of Charizard fatigue, as we have already gotten 3 special illustration rares for this Pokemon this generation. However, the people who control the market are largely resellers, who seem to love Charizard, and that is why the Charizard will most likely still be the most expensive card. Mega Evolution is the newest fully released set on the list, and they have done some really cool things. I personally really liked the old gold card design, but it always felt a little bit too basic. And so when Mega Evolution dropped, fans were stunned to see that there was an entirely new design for the gold cards, which is probably why the gold Mega Lucario EX sells for up to $700. Black Bolt and White Flare dropped and suddenly fans were screaming. Were we getting a brand new Gen 5 game? Was this some kind of tease that we would be getting Black and White remakes? Well, no. However, this set has become one of the most sought after sets for the Scarlet and Violet era, with fans now trying to get a hold of that red Victini, which would set you back about $500. When we heard that we would be getting a Team Rocket set almost 20 years on from the last one, the fans lost their minds. Everyone started to speculate what the most sought after card would be. We had a Ho-Oh card that belonged to Ethan, a Team Rocket's Moltres EX, and even Cynthia's Garchomp EX, all in special illustration rares. However, the most expensive card from this set is the Team Rocket's Mewtwo EX SIR at $550. Journey Together was for a while a very expensive set. Cards from this set were selling for hundreds of dollars. However, as the market began to settle, the set became surprisingly affordable, with even a Lily themed card at $170, which is kinda crazy. Yes, the most expensive card from this set is the Lily's Clefairy EX SIR at $170. Prismatic Evolutions. It's unreal. Yeah, it's unreal. I won't waste time here, the card sells for about $1,200 at the moment, which is insane. Much like Journey Together, Surging Sparks has had quite a turbulent market for a while. At one point, the most expensive card in this set was selling for around $1,000. However, now the Pikachu SIR sells for about $350, which is of course still very expensive. Stellar Crown was an amazing set for a while, with some very expensive EX SIRs inside. However, this was before the EV sets returned and could tear the TCG 4000, which means the cards within this set dropped significantly in price, down to the most expensive being $90 and it being the Squirtle illustration rare. Let's talk about Shrouded Fable, which has the first item card of the video. Shrouded Fable was a bit of a polarizing set, some loved it and some felt it should have been better. But one thing this set did give us was the Gold Earthen Vessel, which fits into just about every deck in the current meta, and that's why this card is $40. Twilight Masquerade for a while had the most expensive Pokemon card within Scarlet and Violet. When Twilight Masquerade came out, everyone was raving about the Greninja SIR, saying it was nice that the most expensive card of the Scarlet and Violet era was not going to be an Eevee or a Charizard. This obviously is no longer the case. However, the Greninja is still very expensive at about $300. Prior to the Pokemon World Championships, everyone was talking about Iron Crown EX from Temporal Forces. It was by far the coolest looking Pokemon card from the set. However, I don't think fans ever expected it would eventually be dethroned by Raging Bolt EX, the card that went on to get a pretty solid position at Worlds and various tournaments, which led to an inflation of the market value, with it now being worth around $70. And that means we reach Paldean Fates and have our first Mew of the video. Yeah, it won't be the last. This is the Shiny Bubble Mew Special Illustration Rare, one of 3 amazing looking shiny illustration rares within this set, that you can pick up for $650. Paradox Rift was pretty controversial, some fans loved it and some fans really could not get behind it. And for ages the most expensive card within this set was the Roaring Moon EX SIR. For ages this Roaring Moon card was at the top of the pile, until they kept reprinting it multiple times, leaving the Groudon illustration rare at the top at $100. And now finally I can talk about my personal favourite set of Scarlet and Violet, 151. This set immediately sold out all across the world, with fans desperately wanting to get a hold of the original 151 Pokemon. And would you believe it, Charizard was the top card from this set. The special illustration rare Charizard EX is actually a pretty nice card, with its value being a little bit high. Charizard EX from 151 can be bought for around $280 nowadays, all thanks to Charizard tags. And from one Charizard to another, we now have the Charizard EX from Obsidian Flames. This card has it all. It's an amazing illustration rare, playable card, and of course, it's a Charizard. However, I am quite surprised that the price of this one is as low as it is. It seems that Obsidian Flames is not particularly popular, as even a Charizard EX special illustration rare goes for $100, which is pretty cheap for a Charizard. What have all of these cards so far had in common? They're all fan favourite characters and Pokemon. However, I would never have expected that the card to dethrone Waifu Iono would be a Magikarp. Yes, the most expensive Paldea Evolved card is the Magikarp Illustration Rare, which sells for $400. And just like that, we are in the final set of Scarlet and Violet. And Scarlet and Violet base set's most expensive card is the Miriam card, closely followed by the Gardevoir card. These two can switch back and forth quite often, with both of them selling for about $50 on a good day. So let's get straight into Sword and Shield with arguably one of its best sets, Crown Zenith. Now, Crown Zenith as a special set was absolutely rammed full of art cards, Galarian Gallery Pokemon, and waifus. However, the most expensive card currently in Crown Zenith is none other than the secret rare Giratina V-Star, which you can add to your collection for $220. Sword and Shield really had its best sets towards the end, as up next we have the most expensive card from Silver Tempest, and this card is truly one of a kind. This is the Lugia V alternate art. Lugia is one of the staple Pokemon, with fans everywhere wanting a slice of that Lugia cake, and so of course the art rare variant of Lugia V would become very expensive, with it nowadays selling for about $450. Giratina really had some amazing cards throughout the Sword and Shield era of Pokemon. However, by far the most expensive was the Giratina V alternate full art from Lost Origin. Not only was this card immensely playable in Lost Zone decks, but it also looks awesome. Unfortunately though, this has made the card one of the most expensive cards from Sword and Shield, with getting this card setting you back $640. Whew, that's expensive. One of the most controversial Pokemon sets since X and Y Steam Siege was definitely Pokemon Go. Some fans absolutely loved the set, while some felt it was a bit of a cash grab from the Pokemon Company. However, despite containing a Radiant Charizard, the most expensive card from this set is actually Mewtwo V's Secret Rare, with this card costing a whopping $85. Now that breaks the bank. Astral Radiance was filled with some of the most iconic cards from Pokemon at the time. Origin Form Dialga and Palkia both had alt arts, as well as Beedrill, Sneasler, and more. But I was genuinely surprised to see that the most expensive card from Astral was actually the alternate art version of Machamp V, with this iconic Gen 1 Pokemon costing $150. And now we are going to hit some big numbers in the upcoming sets, starting with Brilliant Stars. And I really don't need to say more, it's the Charizard alt art that would cost you $400. And finally, one of my favourites, this is Fusion Strike's Gengar VMAX alt art. This card was definitely a sleeper card for months, until Fusion Strike was eventually discontinued. After this, the Gengar VMAX price skyrocketed to over $800. I love special sets, I feel like they're a great way to print a shitload of cards that people just want to have. And Celebrations was one of my favourite from the last couple of generations of Pokemon. And of course the most expensive card is the $200 Metal Charizard promo. Oh yeah, now we're in the big leagues. Evolving Skies, one of the most expensive Pokemon sets from the Sword and Shield era, that has multiple cards over $200 within its roster. But of course the most expensive is the Moonbryon card, which nowadays has a market rate of $10. Nah, I'm just kidding. Its market rate is $2,200. Chilling Reign is of course notorious for being one of the worst sets within Sword and Shield, with it receiving the nickname Chilling Pain amongst fans. However, the most expensive card in this set is actually one of my favourites, the Blaziken VMAX alternate art. This card is literally the only card people want in Chilling Reign, and as such its price has become pretty extortionate, with this tiny piece of cardboard selling for $300. Battle Styles is yet another set that people have very mixed opinions about. However, it began the trend of alternate art cards. The only problem was they were notoriously hard to pull from packs, and because of this, the Tyranitar V alternate art has become the most expensive card within this set at $300. And then we have Shining Fates, which of course has the shiny Charizard VMAX, which for a while was the poster child of expensive Pokemon cards. However, recently the card's value has dropped quite significantly, all the way down to $150. And now we have to be brutally honest, as we have quite a few stinkers coming up. So let me get through them somewhat quickly. First, there is Vivid Voltage, which has the Rainbow Chonkachu, which sells for $120. Then we have Champion's Path, that has the shiny Charizard V. Now this one is certainly not a stinker, as it's actually quite a cool card, I just don't know that I would want to spend $300 on it. Ouch. Darkness Ablaze may outright be the worst set within Sword and Shield. This entire set has a single card that is over $10 in value nowadays, with that card being the regular ultra rare Charizard VMAX, worth $40. That's a lot more reasonable. Despite being one of, if not the worst sets of Sword and Shield, Rebel Trash actually has one card that is very cool. Almost every TCG deck nowadays carries Boss's Orders, a card that gives you control over your opponent's active Pokemon. And so when Pokemon decided to add in a full art version of this card featuring Giovanni, it of course became very valuable, with it selling now for $45, which to be fair for a supporter card that isn't a waifu is pretty good. Sword and Shield as a whole was controversial. The games, the anime, the TCG, and of course Dexit were all a big deal. Thankfully though, they got one thing right with Sword and Shield base when they released the Rainbow Snorlax VMAX card, which is a very cool card. As such, this card, despite being one of 14 secret rares, is now worth $60. And that's it, that's Sword and Shield. So let's move on to Sun and Moon. And of course, we are starting with Sun and Moon Cosmic Eclipse. Now this set is one of the most iconic Sun and Moon sets, and for multiple reasons. It had the tag team Arceus, Dialga and Palkia, as well as the Solgaleo and Lunala tag team, although Arceus, Dialga and Palkia takes the cake at $400. Shining Fates was a bit of a stinker. People were desperately hoping it would recapture the joy of Hidden Fates, but it never reached that potential. Hidden Fates was just way too iconic. And of course, with a shiny Charizard in the roster, this set's most expensive black fire-breathing dragon is worth $500. Sun and Moon was quite similar to Sword and Shield in that it seems that almost all of the good sets came close to the end. As next, we have Sun and Moon Unified Minds, with a card featuring everyone's favourite water gym leader, Misty. Misty's Favour is a beautiful card, and as you can see, this is why it is so expensive, being worth $300. Tag team cards were brand new. I personally loved them, and when they didn't return to Sword and Shield, I was devastated. But thankfully we have some truly iconic tag team cards to remember the amazing duo cards, such as Unbroken Bonds and Gardevoir and Sylveon GX Alternate Full Art. Wow, that's a tongue twister. This card honestly looks like the normal GX version, just with a far heftier price tag of $550. That's the EV tax, I suppose. I thought about skipping the Detective Pikachu set, but I think I should mention it quickly now. The most expensive card in this set is the Detective Pikachu, but weirdly not the stamped version at $35. Sun and Moon Team Up was our introduction to the world of tag team Pokemon cards, and perhaps the most memorable tag team card ever made is the Latias and Latios Alternate Full Art, which in a good conditions can sell for up to $2,600. Sun and Moon Lost Thunder is next. The set featuring Zeraora, Lugia, Mimikyu and other fan favourites contains one of the most expensive Lugia cards on today's list. This is the Rainbow Lugia GX Secret Rare, which sells for $200. Sun and Moon Dragon Majesty was a really cool set. Featuring predominantly cool looking dragon types, the set was a huge success, and fans loved it. However, the resale market for it is actually pretty dire, with the most expensive card from Dragon Majesty not even being a dragon. This is the Ultra Necrozma GX Secret Rare, a really cool gold card that you can get your hands on for roughly $70. Celestial Storm genuinely annoys me. It is a really cool set featuring some of the best cards from Rayquaza to Sizzle and everything in between. And yet the most expensive Pokemon card from this set is the Licia Full Art card at $250. Please, Rayquaza is so much cooler. Sun and Moon Forbidden Light is a weirdly unliked set amongst my friends. Everyone seems to have an irrational hatred of the cards within this set, despite there being some really cool ones. However, I find it weird that in a set containing various legendaries, that Lucario GX is the most valuable at $100, although it does switch quite often with the Greninja GX at $80. Sun and Moon Ultra Prism is filled with waifu cards. Pokemon really knew what they were doing, and of course the most expensive card from this set was the Lily Full Art, followed by both Cynthia and Lusamine. However, Lily is more expensive than both of these by almost $300, with Lily being worth roughly $400. Crimson Invasion was a very interesting set, meant to be a set introducing various Ultra Beasts such as Boswell, Nihilego and more, and this is the first instance of a Gyarados being the most expensive card within a set, although it's only worth $50. Either way, it's a pretty cool card to have. Special sets are amazing, and Shining Legends was one of the best to ever come out. This set featured countless shiny legendaries and fan favourite Pokemon, with the most expensive of these being the Mewtwo GX Secret Rare Alternate Art, which looks awesome. It's just, $500. Burning Shadows, Charizard, $430. Next question. Charizard tax really is a huge thing. However, that tax also extends to EVs, as we have our second Sylveon from Sun and Moon, being the Sylveon GX Secret Rare from Sun and Moon Guardians Rising, which will cost you $100 to get today. And that brings us into Sun and Moon Base, with the most valuable card being an Umbreon GX, and not the Lily Full Art. Yes! This Umbreon GX is actually pretty cheap nowadays at about $90, which isn't bad for an Umbreon. And now it's time to go back to X and Y with one of the most iconic sets from X and Y being Evolutions, a throwback to base set featuring Mega Pokemon and all new full arts. And of course one of those was Charizard, who got a Mega Full Art which you can get for about $150. Steam Siege is often labelled as the worst Pokemon set ever made, with fans all across the world despising it for bad pull rates, boring cards and more. However, the Gardevoir EX Secret Rare is a pretty nice card, and it could be picked up for only $90, which is not bad for such a cool card. Fates Collide contained various popular Pokemon, whether that be Umbreon, Glaceon or Alakazam. And of course, you just cannot compete with Umbreon, with the full art version of this card selling for $150. Earlier in the video, we spoke about the 25th anniversary celebration set. And now it is time for XY Generations, the celebratory set for Pokemon's 20th anniversary. And look, it has a Charizard that actually looks really cool. This version of Charizard X will cost you $170, which once again is a pretty good deal. Breakpoint is one of those sets that felt like an homage to the earlier days of Pokemon, and this is perhaps no more apparent than with the inclusion of a shiny Gyarados from the Lake of Rage. Shiny Gyarados is perhaps one of the most popular shiny Pokemon of all time, and as such this secret rare card has become very popular, with it being worth about $240. Break cards were really quite weird, and XY Breakthrough once again features break cards. However, there is one Pokemon that stands out above the rest in this set, Mewtwo. Mewtwo in this set alone has 8 different cards, and the most expensive of these is the blue version of Mewtwo EX Secret Rare Full Art, which costs $210. And if you are wondering, the red version sells for $130. Oh, we have some bangers coming up now, starting with Ancient Origins, which contains a shiny Mega Rayquaza card worth $600. Which for a card from a special set is really quite cool. And it is not only the shiny version of Mega Rayquaza EX that is valuable, as in Roaring Skies we have the regular Mega Rayquaza EX Full Art card, which is worth $280. Double Crisis is one of my favourite sets from Generation 6, with it containing various throwbacks to old Gen 3 sets, and this is perhaps no more apparent than with the Team Aqua's Kyogre EX, which is worth $430. I actually have this card in a PSA graded slab, which is really cool. And of course, if Kyogre gets an expensive card, so does Groudon. In X and Y Primal Clash, we got the full art version of Primal Groudon EX, a card nowadays worth $190. XY Phantom Forces was a really cool set with some amazing cards, with the most expensive being the incredibly unique silver card for Dialga EX, which nowadays costs $800. I really wanted this one to be a Gengar. XY Furious Fist is just one of those sets that kind of exist. I think the start of every generation has one set that fans just kind of move on from pretty quick, and given this set came out right before the Gen 3 sets, it's kind of forgotten about. And the most expensive of these cards is the Mega Lucario EX Secret Rare Gold card at $150. And that brings us to Flashfire with, once again, you guessed it, a Charizard, which would set you back $650 for the Secret Rare Gold version, and it would even cost you $300 for the normal EX version. And finally, we can finish off X and Y with X and Y base set, with a full art Blastoise EX that only costs $100, which is not that bad for a full art Kanto starter. That means we are finally now in the vintage era of Pokemon cards, and things are going to be getting very expensive. No one really cared that much about the black and white era of Pokemon, and that has led to cards getting pretty expensive, such as the Gold Reshiram from Legendary Treasures that costs $250 to get in your collection. One of my favourite sub-series of the TCG are the Plasma sets. Not only are the Team Plasma cards really cool, but they also have some of the best designed Pokemon in any generation, such as the Team Plasma Dialga EX Full Art from Plasma Blast at $300. Plasma Freeze is a very unique set, as despite coming with the Latios, a Garchomp, and even a full art Deoxys, the most expensive card within this set is a card that you can technically still play with to this day. The Gold Secret Rare Ultra. Ultra Balls have long been a staple of every TCG deck, and this is the only gold version ever created, costing you $800 for an item card, which is crazy. And finally, we finish off the Plasma sub-series with Plasma Storm, and its most valuable card, the Shiny Charizard Secret Rare, which is only $600 for a card that is over 12 years old. This is the card I would be buying if I cared about Charizard cards. Boundaries Cross was not a very popular set at the time. It kind of started the full art waifu craze, and it became really big through Gen 5. So you would think in a set that contained Bianca, Skylar, and the best waifu, Sharon, that one of these would be the most expensive. However, it is actually the full art Black Kyurem EX at $430. And the set that began Dragon types was of course Dragons Exalted, which was filled with Rayquaza, Giratina, Ho-Ohs, and other various legendary Pokemon. However, the most expensive in this set is the full art Mew EX for $540. Dark Explorers is a bit of a stinky set. It had some good enough cards within, but it was played with bad pull rates for the cards that everybody wanted, and at a time when TCG hype was at an all-time low. However, for the first time on today's list, we have a Darkrai EX as the most expensive card within the set at $420. I feel like people largely ignore just how good the characters and Pokemon were in Gen 5. Now we can look back on Gen 5 with nostalgia and acknowledgement that actually this was a pretty good generation, with personally my favourite rival character, N. And in Black and White Noble Victories, the full art N supporter is the most expensive card at $210. However, I can understand why some people may not like this generation, as the genies can be kinda goofy looking. However, in a set that was all about these genies, Emerging Powers gave us some cool enough full art versions, with the most expensive card from this set being the full art Thundurus at $28. But one thing we can all appreciate about Black and White is that this was the generation where Pokemon began to experiment and give us better card designs, such as the full art cards, which were very popular in Black and White base, with the most expensive being one of the first full art cards we ever got, the Zekrom Black full art at $190. That brings Generation 5 to a close, so now let's talk about probably the best generation for the TCG after Generation 1, Gen 4. This set was actually split up into 3 sub-series, starting with the special set that is also its own sub-series, Call of Legends. This set was filled with shiny legendary Pokemon, fan favourites, and even some of the best energy cards we have ever seen, with the most expensive card in this set being the shiny Rayquaza at $500. HeartGold and SoulSilver was technically its own era of Pokemon sets, as they were not included within the Gen 4 Diamond Pearl and even the Platinum set. These sets gave us Prime cards, Legend cards, and many more, with Triumphant being the final set we got for this sub-series. The most expensive card from Triumphant is the Gengar Prime card at $300. Released just before Triumphant was HeartGold SoulSilver Undaunted, a pretty weird name for a TCG set. Seriously, I don't even know what Undaunted means. And if you want an older Umbreon card that is not going to demolish your bank account, you should absolutely get the Umbreon Prime card for only $200. We have spoken about this next card before on the channel, particularly in videos talking about the weirdest Pokemon cards ever made, and HeartGold SoulSilver Unleashed had probably the weirdest card ever released, the Alf Lithograph, which would cost you $160 to get today. And finally, that brings us to HeartGold and SoulSilver base, with the most expensive card from this set being the Lugia Legend card, specifically the top version, which is a whole $2 more expensive than the bottom version. Getting both cards needed for this Legend card would cost you $350. Now let's get into the next sub-series for Diamond and Pearl, the Platinum sets. I really can see why Pokemon started to just include the other generations within the same series of cards. Platinum Arceus was actually quite a small set, but it came full of different Arceus cards, having 9 in total. However, the most expensive card from this set is the Level X Gengar at $250. Before Platinum Arceus dropped, we got Platinum Supreme Victors. Recently I was going through cards with one of my friends who showed me a random shiny Milotic he had destroyed as a kid. Imagine his heart dropping when I told him that shiny Milotic was actually the most valuable card from the Supreme Victors set, costing $220 ungraded or $5,000 in a PSA 10. Sorry Dino. Then we had Rising Rivals, a set that came filled with various Pikachu secret rares such as Flying, Surfing, and Red Cheek Pikachu. These were homage cards to previous generations of Pokemon, and the most expensive of these was the Flying Pikachu secret rare at $180. But it actually isn't the most expensive in the set at the moment. That honour belongs to Snorlax Level X at $190. I mentioned both because these cards fluctuate back and forth constantly. And finally we can finish the Platinum sub-series with Platinum Base, which has the weirdest card yet, the shiny holo rare Vulpix. Platinum added a lot of shiny Pokemon throughout this sub-series, and none of them have even been close to the top, besides this Vulpix, which would cost you $130 today. Which brings us into Diamond and Pearl. Pokemon used to release far less sets throughout the calendar year, and Diamond and Pearl only had 7 sets. By today's standards, that is quite low, but back then this was quite a few sets to get in one generation. So let's start with Stormfront, which had a secret rare Charizard designed off of the base set Charizard, which would cost you $240 today. Diamond and Pearl had a lot of legendary Pokemon found within its region, and so they made an entire set dedicated to legendary Pokemon, Legends Awakened. This set has Mewtwo, it has Dragonite, it has Rayquaza, and yet the most expensive card in this set is the Level X Azelf for $130. The set that I probably have the most nostalgia towards from Diamond and Pearl is Majestic Dawn. This was the first set of Pokemon cards I really remember opening. However, I definitely did not get this Glaceon Level X that sells for $200 nowadays. One thing Diamond and Pearl had was amazing Pokemon that you can encounter. In fact, some may say these were great encounters. Do you see what I did there? This set is by no means an expensive set, as the most expensive cards within this are the Palkia and Dialga Level X cards, with both sitting at about $85. I will say Diamond and Pearl did not have the most imaginative set names, with Secret Wonders being the set released just before Great Encounters. This set had everything, Gen 1 starters, Gen 2 legendaries, and various mythical Pokemon. However, as I said, it had Gen 1 starters, so the most expensive card within this set is the Holo Rare Charizard, at only $120. There is one Pokemon that I feel got a lot of love throughout Generation 4, Lucario. And when mysterious treasures dropped, of course the Level X Lucario would be at the top of the pile, nowadays costing $63. Which finally brings us to Diamond and Pearl Base, which I would argue has the best starter Pokemon as its most expensive, Infernape Level X, which would cost you $70 to get today. All of these cards from the Diamond and Pearl era are surprisingly cheap. As we make our way into the EX era of Pokemon, we are going to start seeing some real heavy hitters, starting with EX Power Keepers. Power Keepers did have a Charizard, however it is nowhere near the value of the Gold Star evolutions of Jolteon, Vaporeon, and Flareon, with the Vaporeon being the most expensive at $1,250, followed by Jolteon at $700 and Flareon at $480. I wonder why Vaporeon's the most expensive. Dragon Frontiers hurts me. Not because the set was bad, actually if anything it was too good. Filled with various Delta species Pokemon and two very expensive Gold Stars, Charizard and Mew. Where Charizard is of course popular, he just cannot beat Mew, who has the most expensive card at $1,700, followed by Charizard at $1,000. Crystal Guardians is my favourite Generation 3 set. It had good Pokemon, good enough pulls, and it is honestly not that hard to get the cards for today. However, if you want the Gold Star Alakazam, be prepared to shell out $800 for it. Surprisingly, this Alakazam beats the Gold Star Celebi at $500. Holon Phantoms did something that Pokemon had not done in the TCG really ever. It expanded on within world lore, including the Delta species Pokemon and where they came from. However, if you don't care about the lore of the TCG, you will care about the most expensive card in this set, the Gold Star Pikachu at $2,000. I feel like people do not respect the Reggie Pokemon enough. This was the legendary trio that often gets overlooked by the Cantonian Birds or the Beasts of Johto. However, Legend Maker did all they could to honour the Titan Pokemon, with each of them getting Gold Star variants, with Regis being the most expensive at about $700, followed by Regirock and then Registeel. Gen 3 has my favourite legendary duo, Groudon and Kyogre. They're just amazing Pokemon with some of the best lore behind them. And they were eclipsed by the most expensive card in EX Delta species. Metagross is the most expensive at $1,200, being the most expensive out of the 3 Gold Stars within this set. We mentioned earlier about the Beasts of Johto, and they would actually get their own Gold Star variants in the EX Unseen Forces set. However, they had a big dog to compete with. Of course, it was Umbreon, with Umbreon EX and Espeon EX being the most expensive cards within this set at about $640 each. These next two sets are some of the most hated and yet beloved sets in the history of the TCG. They're hard to find today, had some really fun cards within them, and are where a lot of people stopped with the TCG. We are talking about Emerald and Deoxys, with the most expensive card from EX Emerald being the Milotic EX at $250. However, Deoxys is a whole different ballgame. This is one of the least printed sets in the history of the TCG, with the most expensive card in the set being the Latias Gold Star at $900. Generation 3 would also give us Team Rocket returns. With the return of Team Rocket, we of course got the return of Team Rocket's Pokemon, with the most expensive being the Rocket's Mewtwo EX. Surprisingly though, the cards behind this Mewtwo are not that far off in price. The Mewtwo goes for up to $800, with pretty much every other EX in the set going for about $500 to $600. Gen 3 also gave us the first recap set for Generation Generation 1, EX Fire Red and Leaf Green, in celebration of the remakes for the first games. Within this set we of course had the Charizard EX, which costs a surprising $830, which is for just an ultra rare. This is actually more expensive than a pack would cost you, which is nowadays at about $630. Thankfully though, Pokemon didn't overdo the Gen 1 set, as they did it one and done. Before Fire Red and Leaf Green though, we got EX Hidden Legends. EX Hidden Legends has probably the weirdest duo of expensive cards. Both at $240, we have the Ninetales EX and the Regirock EX. The Team Aqua vs Team Magma set is filled with various Team Aqua and Magma Pokemon. However, the set also has to compete with EX versions of the Hoenn starters and the Johto Beasts, with the most expensive being the Suicune EX at $270. Gen 3 added a lot of Dragon types to the game, and so the TCG decided to celebrate this immense edition by creating EX Dragon, with Rayquaza, the Latias, and of course, Charizard. And with the Charizard once again, we have our most expensive at $730 for the Secret Rare Charizard. One set that most people forget about is EX Sandstorm. In a generation filled with iconic sets, Sandstorm often gets left behind, and that is why this is probably the cheapest set in all of Generation 3, with the most expensive card being the Aerodactyl EX at only $125. And so we come to a close on Gen 3 with Ruby and Sapphire, and also the end of our list for sets made in-house by Pokemon. The most expensive card within EX Ruby and Sapphire is the Mewtwo EX at only $170, which for one of the oldest EXs ever released is not a bad price. So now we have the good stuff, the Wizards of the Coast era of Pokemon cards. Wizards was a pretty good partnership for Pokemon for a while, however the E-Series sets proved that the quality of the collaboration was starting to dwindle, with most cards from the E-Series and Neo era being really poor quality, such as the Holo Gyarados from Skyridge, which would cost you $1,200 in a near mint. My favourite Wizards era set though is Aquapolis. It was the set me and my wife got our first graded card from, a Lantern. However, my Lantern is cheap compared to the most expensive card from the set. Despite containing Umbreon, Lugia, Espeon, and many more, the most expensive card from this set is the Crystal Nidoking card at $1,000. And then the final E-Series set was Expedition base set. Wizards had way more plans for the E-card set, and Expedition was the kickoff point for them. However, their partnership ended prematurely. Expedition has some cool cards though, with the most expensive being the Charizard at $700. After 3 years of making the TCG in the West, Wizards wanted to celebrate, and so they created the Legendary Collection. A set featuring various cards from previous sets, including the first 4, as well as some Darker Light cards as well. We're about to see a few Charizards coming up, with the Legendary Collection Holo Charizard being the most expensive for this set at $400, which brings us to the Neo sets. These sets were plagued with poor print quality, bad quality control, and many more issues. So let's start with Neo Destiny, which had a Shining Charizard. Need I say more? This card is worth about $6,500 nowadays. These Shining cards actually have a pretty common error known as Holo Shift, so if you have one of these, make sure to check you don't have a Holo Shift version, as it could be worth more money. As for Neo Revelation, this set had the first Shining cards ever printed, with Magikarp and the most expensive Gyarados at $1,200, while Magikarp is $400. You might be wondering why these cards are so cheap. Well, they're actually some of the most printed cards in the history of the TCG. This was an all-time high for Pokemon TCG, and the hype didn't really die down until the E-Series cards. With Neo discovering the most expensive card is the Umbreon Holo Rare, the first ever Moonbreon at $1,800, and even in Neo Genesis, the Lugia is the same price at $1,800 as well. And finally, we have the original series of Pokemon cards, from Gym Challenge all the way back to base set. So let's start with Gym Challenge, which had Blaine's Charizard. I told you we'd be seeing a lot of Charizards. This card is worth $770. As for Gym Heroes, we have another Gengar card coming up, with Sabrina's Gengar, which would cost you $600. Team Rocket is probably the best set from the original series. It had cool cards, fun Pokemon, and of course was based on one of the best evil teams Pokemon had ever seen, with the most expensive card being the Holo Dark Charizard at $730. Wizards weren't very inventive at this point when it came to naming the TCG sets, as next we have Base Set 2. It's like Base Set, but 2. This set basically just combined cards from Base Set, Fossil, and Jungle into one set, sort of like Pokemon does nowadays with special sets. And the most expensive is the Charizard, yet again, for $300. There really are just 2 Pokemon that were popular back in the original series, as in Fossil, the most expensive card is the Holo Gengar at $330. Thankfully though, Jungle does switch up the most expensive card, as we get to see Snorlax yet again on this list. Snorlax is one of my favourite Gen 1 Pokemon, and it is surprising he has not appeared more throughout this list. Getting the Holo Snorlax would cost you $300. And finally, we have reached base set, where the most expensive card is the Charizard, where the near mint unlimited version would cost you $500. That's a bit of a bargain if you ask me.